The top business stories live from the Sky News City studio. Calls for major investment to help homes switch away from gas heating altogether. I'll hear from the Chief Executive of National Gas. Confirmation that the state pension will rise by 8.5% under the triple lock. And how more people are using buy now, pay later services as overdraft and credit card use declines. Good afternoon, this is Business Live with me, Ian King. The government has been told it needs to spend £30 billion a year to future-proof the UK's infrastructure. In its second five-yearly review, the National Infrastructure Commission recommends a 30-year programme to transform Britain's energy network, public transport, roads and water infrastructure. Well, in particular, the Commission calls for a comprehensive programme to replace gas boilers, which currently heat 88% of English buildings, with heat pumps. It recommends spending £1.3 billion per year until 2035 to cover the full cost of heat pump installations for lower-income households. It adds that £1.9 billion per year is needed to provide subsidies of £7,000 for all other households to install heat pumps. And it says it will cost £3.2 billion per year to improve energy efficiency and install heat pumps across the public sector estate and social housing. Well, joining me now is John Butterworth. He's Chief Executive of National Gas, which owns and operates the UK's gas network. John, welcome to you. You don't think these proposals are practical. Why?
Yeah, good evening. I think it's a tale of two parts, really, in terms of the Commission's recommendation to create a gas transmission hydrogen backbone right around the UK to decarbonise heavy industry. I think that's a really good thing to do and gives us security of supply and gives certainty. I think what's difficult is to understand practically if we're going to decommission 23 million gas supplies to households and 500,000 gas supplies to industry, from fish and chip shops to hotels to swimming baths, to hospitals, etc. How is that going to happen? And there's not that much detail around that, because 11 million homes are flats in our cities. Where are you going to put a heat pump? How are you going to rip it to bits to get the infrastructure in? So it just needs a little bit more thinking about in terms of the detail.
Well, I mean, these are clever people. I mean, the Commission's headed by John Armitt, one of Britain's most distinguished engineers. Are you saying that they don't know what they're talking about?
No, not at all. The Commission have done generally what they think is right. And John and his team, have put a lot of work into this. From my perspective, I've been in the industry 45 years. If we're going to fit heat pumps and decommission the gas distribution system, not the transmission system, they fully support that. Then, there needs to be detail about, how are we going to do that? How are we going to, get the insulation to a standard that a heat pump works? Because a heat pump is low-grade heat, so it's got to be supplemented. In Finland, Switzerland, Sweden, they have wood burners, to take that edge off in the winter, etc. So it just needs a little bit of thinking about so it can be practically implemented in the field.
Why is it, John, do you think that the Infrastructure Commission has ruled out hydrogen so categorically?
Yeah, so there's a couple of things. I think they have a concern about safety, and we've spent an absolute fortune up on our test site. The gas networks are now 84% renewed and safe. That will be finished, ready for hydrogen. And we have a test site which we've spent an absolute fortune on, making sure that, as always, the gas system is as safe as it possibly can be. So there is no safety risk. So I don't know where that has actually come from. And that needs some talking about. And then the second thing is it's predicated on green hydrogen. And there's not enough green hydrogen at the minute. But, as we make blue hydrogen, where we, use fossil fuel, but we sequestrate the emissions, that process has got to nearly 90% efficient now. So as long as we've got enough gas, and we've decades of it in the North Sea, we've got enough hydrogen at scale. But blue hydrogen's sort of been discounted, and we've only looked at green hydrogen, what we can see in the report. So I think there are fundamental differences. With blue hydrogen, we can supply the nation as we do today.
John, you've talked about the practicalities of phasing out gas boilers there and dismantling the network. I mean, of course, that leaves you without a business, we should say, if that comes to pass. But what about the National Infrastructure Commission's actual numbers? What are the costs of replacing natural gas with hydrogen, as you'd like to see happen over time?
Yeah, so just to really repeat that, I run the National Gas Transmission System, and the Commission have been highly supportive of what we're going to do in the business that I lead. So this is about the distribution business. But the costs are going to be around 230 billion to put heat pumps in, if you can do that. Then you've got to reinforce the system. That's just the cost of the heat pumps. And you've got numbers that are banded around about 70 billion to decommission the existing gas network, which we've been paying for the last 50 years to replace. So there are big numbers flying around here, Ian.
There are indeed. I mean, you seem quite sceptical about heat pump technology from some of the comments you've been making here.
No, I think the answer is a joined up view of energy in the UK. I'm passionate about insulation, because if we had a systematic street by street enterprise effort on insulation for everybody, not just the privileged, we'd get CO2 emissions down 35% because we'd be using less energy, and we'd reduce bills by 35%. And then we can take stock. What would be suitable for heat pumps? What would be suitable for hydrogen-ready boilers, etc. And it would be a blended response, depending on the type of building and the complexity of insulation. If you get world-class insulation in a house, heat pumps are good. I'm not saying for 1 minute they're not, but it needs to be a blended answer between hydrogen and electricity.
Notwithstanding the difficulties of getting heat pumps installed in the 11 million flats up and down the country, would it make sense in your view to mandate heat pumps with all new build housing?
No, I think we should mandate heat pumps, and we should mandate hydrogen-ready boilers. We've got a network that can go 7 times around the world that customers have paid for over the last 50 years, where there's a pipe from the beach to everybody's home. Why wouldn't we try and use that to keep the cost down?
OK, John, we have to leave it there. Appreciate you joining me today. Thanks very much indeed.
Thank you.
Some other business news stories for you now. And the state pension is set to rise by 8.5% in April next year, following today's publication of the September inflation figures. Well, under the triple lock, the state pension rises each year in line with whichever is the highest between average annual earnings growth from May to July, inflation in the year to September, or 2.5%. Well, the Office for National Statistics confirmed today that consumer prices inflation in September was unchanged at 6.7%, the same as August, and ending 3 consecutive months of easing price rises. And obviously the rate of wage inflation at 8.5% was higher. Shell has signed a deal with Qatar that will see the Gulf states supplied with liquefied natural gas for the next 27 years, further reducing Europe's dependence on Russian gas. Under the deal, which equals Qatar's biggest and longest gas supply deal with Europe, it will provide 3.5 million metric tonnes of liquefied natural gas a year from 2026 to be delivered to the Gate LNG terminal at the port of Rotterdam. The gas will be sourced from 2 Qatari gas fields, in which Shell has a 6.25% stake and a 9.375% stake. Shares of Barratt Developments fell by as much as 4% today after it admitted to a slowdown in reservations since the beginning of July. The UK's biggest house builder and its second largest by stock market value said it had averaged 169 net reservations per week up to the 8th of October. That was down from 188 in the same period last year. It said reservation activity had continued to reflect the mortgage challenges faced by potential home buyers and added that the outlook remained uncertain. Now, nearly 1 in 3 British adults have used Buy Now Pay Later facilities during the last year. That's according to research published today, commissioned by ClearPay, one of the big players in the sector. Respondents found that nearly 4 in 5 respondents said the service helped them reduce the stress related to the cost of large purchases. Well, joining me now is Rich Bayer, he's the UK country manager at ClearPay. Rich, welcome to you. Obviously, this report sounds very much like what you'd want these respondents to say. They weren't being led at all.
Not at all, sir. Thank you for having me. Yeah, we're really proud of this. We were just down in Parliament where we were sharing the results of this report. And yeah, look, we think overall, the conclusion of the report, the smart folks at Oxford, is that buy now, pay later, and more specifically, ClearPay is having a very positive impact on the economy. Both consumers and retailers, as revealed by the report, are benefiting. That 1 in 3 consumers are using it, as you say, because there's less stress, it's cheaper, it's more convenient. With respect to the retailers, we've driven nearly £1 billion of incremental revenue to the retailers, which also correlates to about £700 million impact to the GDP.
Rich, you've a lot of evidence that Gen Z and millennial consumers in particular are using buy now, pay later. What about older consumers? Are you getting much of a breakthrough there?
Yeah, we are actually. That is one of our fastest growing segments. Certainly this ClearPay was founded as Afterpay in Australia by a millennial who grew up during the economic 2008 crisis and saw there was a different relationship with money for that generation. So we started out very heavily in the millennial and Gen Zs, but we are breaking through with respect to the older consumers. As I said, it's probably our fastest growing segment.
How would you persuade an older consumer like me, someone who takes out a lot of, but uses his credit card a lot and pays it off in full each month? I mean, is that someone who necessarily is going to adopt BNPL?
Not necessarily, and not everybody is fortunate enough to pay off their credit card in full every month. I think especially facing these inflationary pressures, putting generations aside, we're happy to be a great solution for all generations when they're facing this cost of living crisis so that they can use a budgeting tool without interest. One could argue that everybody should be using this, as you know, why rid yourself of your money any sooner than you have to? So it's not necessarily folks in distress with inflation. It's also, some would argue, where the smart money is.
But would you accept that there are some consumers for whom BNPL is not appropriate?
Yes, but I don't believe we actually let them into our program. Our program has a lot of protections. First, we have an approval process, and then secondly, we have a hardship process where if they go sideways on a payment, we pause their accounts. One important thing to note here is we are very different from the credit card industry. The credit card industry makes money when people fail, when people don't pay back, and that's how they make their money. We lose money when people don't pay us back. We are paid by the retailers, and when someone goes sideways in our business and doesn't pay us back one of the installments, we pause the account, we talk to them about hardship, and figure out a solution. The good news is it's working because 95% of the people pay us back on time, and 90% of the people use a debit card when paying, which is indicative of the fact that they're using their own money and budgeting.
Rich, to what extent do you think you've been helped by the fact that a lot of what we used to call the payday loan providers have been basically regulated out of business?
Yeah, any comparison to that is confusing to me. We're a very different value proposition. We're a budgeting tool that doesn't have any interest. And it's just a way for folks to pay over time and manage their budget. So we're content with that, our position there.
Okay, Rich, good to see you this afternoon. Thanks very much indeed for joining me.
Thank you. Have a good day.
Still to come here on Business Live, we'll have a look at how the markets are doing this Wednesday afternoon. Stay with us.
5 of us have made it out of the car.
Welcome to Backstage, the film and TV podcast.
Fly Emirates, fly better. Fly Emirates, fly better. Thank you.
Well, stocks have sold off as the session has gone on, as growing tensions in the Middle East have driven investors towards what we call a risk-off approach in the jargon. Here's how stocks in Europe have ended up this afternoon. All of the main continental European indices off between 4/5 of 1% and 1% or so. One of the biggest fallers in Europe today has been the Swiss engineering giant ABB. It's finished off nearly 7% on a trading update. Well, here in London, the FTSE 100 also firmly in negative territory, down by 87 points. 34 points of that alone has come from AstraZeneca, which fell by some 4% or so after data produced in a trial for experimental treatment for lung cancer proved disappointing. The FTSE off by just over 1% in the round. All of the house builders are lower on the statement from Barratt Developments that I mentioned earlier on in the programme. Barratt off, as you can see, by 5%, Taylor Wimpey by 4.25%, and Berkeley Group by 2.5%. Another faller related to that was one of the FTSE's newer members, Howden Joinery, which is the UK's biggest supplier of fitted kitchens. There weren't many blue chip gainers to talk about today, but the Premier Inn owner, Whitbread, that finished up by 1.5%. It's 1 1/3, really, after its half-year results. Well received this morning. Outside the FTSE 100, it's a similar story. Persimmon, Bellway and Crest Nicholson all lower on the Barratt statement. Look at that, Bellway off by nearly 6% there. Over on Wall Street, well, all of the main stock indices are trading to the downside right now. One of the big talking points this afternoon is Morgan Stanley. Its shares have fallen by 7% following publication of its third quarter results. We get updates from Tesla and Netflix after the closing bell this evening. On the foreign exchange markets, well, as you would expect on a day like this, there's been a bit of safe haven buying for the good old US dollar. Sterling off by just over 1/4% against the greenback. The pound finished up by about 1/8 or so of 1% against the euro. The single currency, meanwhile, off by 2/5 of 1% against the dollar. As for the oil price, well, that's higher on the session, but it's given back some of the gains that it picked up earlier in the session. A barrel of Brent crude currently will cost you $91.20 a barrel. That is up just under 1.5% on the day. Well, with me now, a great friend of the programme, Lucy Coates, Investment Director at JM Fin. Lucy, good to see you. We had these inflation numbers today, a bit higher than everyone was expecting. Read across for the Bank of England?
Absolutely. I mean, we had hoped just for a small tick down. We're talking about a tiny increase, but we want to see this gradual decline in inflation. What this sheds light is what decision is the Bank of England going to make in a couple of weeks' time. We had assumed rates would be on hold. There is a question mark over that. We're seeing food inflation come down, but we're seeing rents rise and there's pressure in other parts. Additionally, we've seen a spike in the oil price and a spike in energy costs. So that's unhelpful for inflation and unhelpful for interest rate.
Well, Charlie White-Thompson from Saxo Bank, who was sat where you are this morning, said he thinks the bank will raise again on the 2nd of November. What do you think?
I wouldn't bet against it. I wouldn't bet against it at all. I think we had got that baked in earlier in the year, and then we've gone a little bit more what we call dovish, a bit softer on it. But I think inflation is the biggest enemy of equity markets.
Very interesting. And, of course, bond markets as well, lest we forget. Yeah.
Absolutely, yes. I mean, we all talk about how poor equity markets have been, except for a select few stocks in the year to date. But actually, the bond markets have imploded, and hence you're able to buy short-dated gilts below par, which is very attractive, safe haven.
Yeah. Now, looking at, there's a very interesting situation going on with the US at the moment in terms of trying to restrict China's ability to chip technology. That's affected a couple of the players today.
It has massively. So the US is putting export controls in on high-end technology. So we've had reporting today, the largest European tech company called ASML. It's a Dutch company. Many people won't have heard about it. And it sells machines to the semiconductor manufacturers, so to the likes of Taiwan Semiconductor. You're seeing very much a sort of a trough in that cycle of semiconductors at the moment as recession and interest rate rises have hit. That's a natural business cycle, nothing that we can control. But the high-end machines, which are called the sort of extreme ultraviolet machines, they make sort of silicon wafers, the smallest nanometers known to man. Those are not allowed to be sold to China, and also they've got to have licenses for the less capable machines now. And their earnings for next year are going to be flat. That's not what the market had hoped for. But we should look more positive to 2025 when they're expecting to see much stronger growth once again.
Someone who's watching this that may not be in the details as much as you are might say, well, hang on, ASML's a Dutch company. Why is it subject to restrictions imposed by the US government?
Quite right. So the US has come to an agreement with the Dutch government to say we want these controls put in place. And ASML is the world-leading company. These machines actually make wafers using light. I mean, it is, if anybody's got 5 minutes, have a look at the website because it is absolutely fascinating. And these machines are not small. They're $150 million.
Would this have implications for, I'm thinking of a British company in particular here, Renishaw, which is one of the world leaders in advanced measurement. Does that suffer from this? No,
not to well, it may do to a different degree, but at the moment we're all looking at sort of artificial intelligence. We're looking at the absolute top end of chip-making capability, and ASML is way ahead of any other company in the world, and hence why companies like Taiwan use their machines.
Yeah, now another stock caught up on all this, of course, is NVIDIA, a big US chip company.
A big US one, so naturally you would expect that to suffer in the US export controls and what those... so it has graphics processor units and it's got the most advanced chips, and they're in huge demand as we move through this artificial intelligence cycle. And those machines are, and those chips are being prevented from being sold into China. Again, they can sell lesser developed capability into China. It won't hit earnings just now. It's going to be 25, 26 by the time those earnings are hit. And the suspicion is that companies like Baidu in China will be front-loading their orders now.
In the meantime, we had some Chinese GDP data that was actually quite good overnight.
It's really good at 4.9%. It's very near the target we expected at 5%. And let's face it, it looks great compared to the UK at 0.2.
It really does. But, is this a sign that China is going to sort of manage itself a so-called soft landing?
Well, one would hope so. One tries to believe that the data that we get from China is correct, but you have got a developing economy. I think if you'd asked me 5 years ago, would China be the world's largest economy in another 5 years' time, I would have said undoubtedly. But the US seems to be competing very strongly, so I think that's in doubt. And the US certainly is sort of putting in controls everywhere to prevent that from happening.
Yeah, absolutely. Lucy, always good to see you. Thanks very much.
Thank you.
That's it from me. I'm back again at 11:30 tomorrow with our morning edition of Business Live. Hope very much to see you then. In the meantime, do stay tuned. Coming up after this very short break, it's Mark Austin with the News Hour, and of course, he's live in Jerusalem. Thanks for joining me today. Hope to see you tomorrow. Cheerio.